Okay, so short reflection on the Dhamma. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Dutiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Dutiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. Tatiyampi Buddhaṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Dhammāṃ saranang gacchāmi, Tatiyampi Sanghaṃ saranang gacchāmi. So, nice to see everybody again. I keep wanting to say for our Friday night, we kind of got in this habit of saying a Friday night party. We used to have this meditation on Friday. So now Tuesday night party. So there's, it was nice kind of meditating just now. Had kind of nice rain falling and good background noise for meditation. And when you go out to the forest to meditate, or you're staying in a kuti, or you're under a glot, sometimes kind of this rain comes down and kind of blots out all the other sounds. So often, especially if it's the jungle is actually, it can be like very loud. You know, kind of, you have these, we have cicadas here too, and they make this noise like, but in the actual, like in Asia, I mean, for people who lived in Sri Lanka, I think only Bill hasn't, but there can be really loud. like you can't talk to the person next to you. It's like this huge, sound of cicadas, sound of kind of jungle wildlife. And then when the rain comes, all those things kind of quiet down and kind of just disappears. And there's just this sound of the rain. Either on your kuti or, over your umbrella tent, if you're there in the jungle in an umbrella tent. And it can be something really peaceful. So actually there's this passage in the Canon in the Buddha's time, and also now, monks observe this kind of a Vas season, which the first one is actually coming up in a few days. Monks enter kind of this Vas season, and they couldn't wander during that time. And they had to stay in a dwelling. Couldn't stay in what the Buddha called a non-dwelling. They couldn't stay in like a cave or like a tree hollow, or they couldn't stay under their like mosquito net. So you have to live in an actual building during that time. And sometimes people would kind of make their own little buildings, or lay supporters would build buildings for these individual monks, and those monks would go and stay, some of them by themselves, for vasa. Just stay off on their own. And then they would put these grass thatches along the edge of the hut. So it would have this kind of pole along the center, I think, called a ridge pole. And then they would have all this grass along the side. And they still make kind of huts like that today in Thailand, and probably in Sri Lanka too, that monks can stay in. And so there's actually this very famous verse in the Theragatha where there's a monk, and he's got his hut all thatched. And then in India, when the rain comes, I don't think it's like this. I was there one time, and I think it was like after the monsoon, but in like a second, people are completely drenched. It's just this torrential downpour. The rivers, they have these completely dry riverbeds. I'm sure many people here probably been to India. But it looks like a desert, there's nothing there. And then during the rains, these things become raging rivers. It's huge, like very wide rivers, like a mile, or like a kilometer wide. And they just become these raging rivers from nothing. These torrential rains come down. And so there's this famous passage in the Canon where this monk says, my hut is well thatched, so rain, God, if you like. It's this monk who's got his hut all thatched up for the rains. He says, my mind is well centered, so rain, God, if you like. And this is what the Buddha describes as a kind of pleasant abiding. There's a kind of metaphor almost to this, because the Buddha uses metaphors with rain a lot, because when we have a lot of well-thatched hut, even when the rain comes, it can be something quite pleasant. It doesn't have to be something that's tricky or terrifying. It doesn't have to be something that gets us wet. Actually, I like listening to I find it pleasant to listen to the sound of rain. And actually, when I was growing up, one of the friend of my mother's, he used to love to sit out and watch these thunderstorms, so long as it was safe. And so the metaphors that come with this all the time, like this kind of metaphor with the kuti, the image we get of this monk sitting in the kuti with his mind well-centered, is that the rains that come can't affect his mind. They can't kind of penetrate the well-thatched roof of his kuti. And so the kind of metaphor that comes through here is, is kind of striking and also pleasant if we've gotten used to the sound of rain, which is that in a similar way, if our mind is well-centered, if our mind is kind of well-thatched, then regardless of whether or not it's raining outside, we don't get wet. Kind of rain, rain God if you like. And so the interesting thing here is that when monks have to set up this dwelling, they have to stay in one place. It means they can't wander around during the rains. Traditionally, monks have this kind of wandering lifestyle where you wander from one place to another and you live off of alms food. Still monks living that way in Asia. Canada, it's a bit tricky. It's a big country and developed after modern transportation. So you have to walk a long way to go to another village. But when monks wander around in this way, sometimes they would, trample crops. And also wandering during the rains, you're exposed. If you're out there under a tree with your umbrella tent, which is this kind of umbrella, and you put a mosquito net around it, then when the rain comes, it penetrates that. Sometimes rain comes like from the side and can very quickly penetrate your umbrella tent, can very quickly get you soaked. And similarly, if a monk is out wandering in the woods, wandering on one of these kind of things that seem nice and safe, and a torrential downpour comes, he could find himself, or she, if it's a nun, at a river that was once very small and is now just completely filled and is impassable. It's kind of dangerous. So during the rains, these kind of things, just wandering around, being outside the kind of comforts of your hut, being outside the kuti could be dangerous. Also kind of not good because you would trample all the new crops. And so the other metaphor that comes along here with this monk's well-centered mind is that his mind isn't wandering outside. Same as during the rains, is staying inside of his kuti, his mind well-centered. The ridgepole is strong, the roof is thatched. And so the rain god can rain if he likes, and this monk won't get wet. And so in the same way, when our mind goes out, goes out to grab onto things outside, goes out to wander outside, it can be unsafe, just like during the rains. Goes out to wander and grab onto, people that we care about too much. Goes out to wander and grab onto our job. Goes out to wander and grab onto our house. Goes out to wander and grab onto our car. Then when the rain comes, we can get wet. If we're not safe inside our kuti with a well-thatched roof, with a strong ridgepole. So right here, when we sit down to meditate, this is where the metaphor gets extended a bit. What we're actually doing is we're trying to make this kind of dwelling for ourselves. Actually, what these kind of, in Pali, when these kind of things are called viharas, vihara dhammas, some of them, which means vihara is a dwelling, means you dwell in them. They're kind of a dwelling place for our mind, something that we create in our mind, kind of pleasant place to be, a safe place to be with a well-thatched roof. And the nice thing about this metaphor is that actually a lot of the times, sometimes these monks would have to be involved in putting these things together themselves, or in watching the construction of them. So they have to know if the roof is well thatched, right? Have to be skilled in knowing how to thatch that roof. Or if somebody else did it for you, is it going to leak? Yeah? Have to be skilled in knowing, is the ridgepole really sturdy in this hut? Is it something that's going to get blown away? And what about the walls? That's something we can kind of prepare. This monk sitting in his hut before the rains, he knows that his roof is well thatched. He knows that his ridgepole is strong. And so he knows the rain god can rain if it likes. And so in the same way with our meditation, when we start to bring our mind back to our breath, we start to bring our mind back to our object of meditation, there's actually a skill to be developed here. Right? So it isn't just the case that we, as a monk, that monk would just hop into any old hut and, not knowing if it has a hole in the roof, just settle down there for the rains. Right? He has to learn to test. He has to have a skill in knowing when his hut is well thatched. And in the same way, when we create this dwelling in our mind, we create this sense of peace in our mind, we create a pleasant place in our mind to abide, we also have to learn to evaluate, what is it that makes it peaceful? What is it that makes it pleasant? What is it that makes it safe? Yeah? And so this is the kind of thing that we do at the end of the meditation. And when we do this, what we actually gain is a kind of skill. We gain a skill in creating this dwelling place in our mind and in knowing where the holes are. Yeah? Because in the same way, maybe the first dwelling place you dwell in, I remember when I first went to ordain, I was at a monastery in Ottawa, and it was very new at that time. Now it's quite well established, and all the buildings are very sturdy. But when it first started, it was kind of like a house and then a barn, and just they built a couple of kutis by the time I was there. But then one of them was in an old granary where they used to keep it was an old tool shed where the previous owner used to keep his tools and had been converted into a kuti, So this old kuti, building a kuti out of that, I liked it. Anyway, it was a nice place to stay, but that kuti had its quirks, So one of the things was that the floor didn't have insulation. So when you were starting your fire, you had to do it in such a way that you knew when you lit the fire, that the temperature at night might be very cold, and it was going to drop a certain amount during the night. So you had to make your room hot enough that you wouldn't get too cold during the night, And so sometimes you'd have to make the room really, really hot, and then you wake up in the morning, it'd be like 16. It was kind of quite cold, kind of this older kuti, which I actually really like staying there. And then the next time I moved to a different kuti, and this kuti was a new one, but very small. And it had propane heat rather than wood heat. So in this kuti, if you turn the heat up really high, it had an automatic thermostat which would kick in. But I was sleeping in a kind of loft at the top of the building. It was kind of this very small hut with a half kind of loft sticking out, and that's where you would sleep because the heat was there. And if you crank the heat up too much in that building, the air wouldn't escape, or you would run out of air. So you'd wake up in the middle of the night kind of suffocating, have these kind of dreams like you're running out of air and got to wake up, and then finally you wake up and you realize, whoa, there's not enough air in here. But the point of all this is that each of these dwellings was different. The characteristics of the dwelling were different. And with these different characteristics, couldn't just apply the same technique every time. In the first kuti, I could light this raging fire in the wood stove and be totally comfortable. And it was an older building, so it had drafts coming through, so never ran out of air. In the next building, it was quite new and well sealed, so I could light it up really hot, but I would run out of air. And in the same way, when we build these dwelling places in our minds, when we try to build a well-thatched dwelling in our mind, each time we sit down to do that, and for each of us, we each have different characteristics, different tendencies, might have different, dwellings in our mind, like these different kutis, right? So what that means is that we can't all do the exact same thing and always get the same result. It also means that we can't always do the same technique and expect to get the same result. So in this kuti, if it was summertime outside and I lit a roaring fire, I'd be totally stifled in the first or the second kuti. If it was rainy in the first kuti, it might be different than if it was rainy in the second kuti. In the fall, it would be different. Each time the temperature changed, you had to gauge the amount of firewood you would use, gauge what the temperature outside was, gauge what the temperature inside was. And if you tried to write a manual on how to do that, it would be like 1,000 pages, right? When the temperature goes up 0.01 centigrade and outside there's 15% humidity plus, X amount of wind plus whatever, all these different factors. Couldn't write a manual for that. Couldn't write a technique for that. And in the same way, the Buddha didn't write a manual per se in terms of just do technique X, Y, Z for our minds. What he gave us were tools to work with, to build a dwelling place in our mind, to build a dwelling place in our mind that's safe from rain, that's well thatched. But to get these tools, we have to gain a skill ourselves. So in the same way, you can't write a 1,000-page manual for how to set the temperature right in the kuti every time. But what you found was, living in a kuti like that for a long period of time, drafty kuti, you got to intuitively know it. You gain this kind of skill in the kuti so that you could be outside and then walk inside and think, okay, I know about the amount of firewood that there's got to be in here. Just by feeling it, just by gaining a familiarity with it. Now that kind of familiarity is something that you can get taught to a certain extent by somebody else. You could learn, if I wrote a manual on that kuti for the next inhabitant, they could learn to a certain extent, about that. But at the end of the day, taking that manual to make that dwelling a comfortable place, to make it a place they could live in full time, to make it a place that they were skilled in, they would have to go into the kuti, live there, start trying to light fires in the depths of winter, start trying to figure out how to manage the rain if there's a leak. They would have to do all of that themselves. And after doing that for a number of years, they would have an intuitive knowledge of it. They would know it for themselves. They would be comfortable dwelling in that place. And so it's the same way for our mind. When we want to have a comfortable dwelling in our mind, we know what our objective is, right? We want our minds to settle down with the breath. We want our minds to settle down with an object of meditation, not to roam outside where we can get soaked by the rain, but to stay inside when the rain god is raining in a well-thatched kuti. But then when our mind wanders out, it wanders out in different ways. So how do we bring it back? How do we stop it? How do we make our roof well-thatched? How do we make our walls firm? How do we make our ridgepole strong? So that we can say to the rain god, rain if you like. And this is something that each of us needs to figure out on our own, right? Of course, we can have the support. We have the support of the Buddha, right? We have his teachings in the suttas that tell us, okay, you're going to make a dwelling with 4 walls and a roof here. You're not going to make a, inverted triangle in the ground, right? So we know the basic outline. But then finding the thatch, putting it on, tying it tightly, and learning how to keep out the elements, that's something that's up to us. But the nice thing about this is that when we just come into practice, when we just start practicing building a dwelling like this in our minds over and over again, what we gain is a skill in building the dwelling. What we gain is a skill, an intuitive knowledge in knowing when our walls are sturdy, in knowing when our ridgepole is strong, in knowing when our roof is well thatched, in knowing how to do this in different elements, in different conditions, even in different kutis, with different materials. And so when that time comes, we can be a confident person, a person who knows, I've created a dwelling in my mind that's safe. I've created a dwelling in my mind that's secure. With my mind well centered. And at that time we can say, rain, rain, God, if you like. So this is something that the Buddha teaches is possible for us. These kind of metaphors in the Canon, they're very beautiful and very nice. But they're also, even nicer than that, is to actually practice them. Is to actually gain those benefits for ourselves in our life. Is to actually know, if the rain comes, I've built a place that's pretty safe here. I've built a place that's pretty nice. And this is an option for us. It's a possibility for us. It doesn't just have to stay in the canon. It doesn't just have to stay in the books. It doesn't have to be with the minds of the teachers. It can be in our own mind. A safe place to dwell, regardless of what the weather outside is like.